Hey, everybody. I hope you're doing well today. Well, let's take a look at the single indicators of development. And there are three sorts of indicators that we're going to look at. They're the financial, health, and education measures. First, let's start off with taking a look at the financial measures. And those would be GDP and GNI per capita, and GDP and GDP per capita at purchasing power parity. So what do those mean? All right, first of all, GDP and GNI per capita are single measures that are often used to assess growth and or development. And you've been exposed to some of these things earlier. But GDP per capita, listen to this definition, may be defined as the total of all economic activity in a country, regardless of who owns the productive assets, divided by the number of people in the population. What does this mean? This means that the income of foreign companies producing within a country would be included in the national income of that country, but the activity of its own companies producing outside the country would not. What does that mean? We'll take the best example in the United States, right? You know that McDonald's comes from the United States. If you're talking about GDP per capita, GDP would take into account all of the sales of McDonald's within the borders of the United States. Gross domestic product. Domestic means house. So that's all the money being produced, or all of the value of all of the things being produced in a house, in a country, in a particular period of time, which is pretty much always a year. Okay, regardless of where they're from. So McDonald's producing in the United States, it would only take into account the McDonald's sales in the US, not the McDonald's sales globally, only domestically. That's why it's gross domestic product. But that number would also take into account any foreign firms who have companies within the United States and what they produce. And of course that total, because that stuff is gross domestic product. Those products are produced in the United States, in the house, the domestic house of the United States. So that, and then you divide it by the total population. So that means that McDonald's domestic production and any foreign companies working within the United States, their production would be counted towards the United States GDP per capita, assuming you divide it by the number of people. As opposed to GNI, which is gross national income per capita. This is the total income that's earned by the country's factors of production, regardless of where the assets are located, divided by the number of people in the population. Say now, that means for GNI of the United States, its gross national income, McDonald's belongs where? To the United States. So, and its income. So all of the US national companies, no matter where they are operating, that income would count in the United States, and of course it's per capita, so you divide it by the population. So therefore, McDonald's revenues and profits all around the world would then count towards the United States GNI per capita, but the foreign firms operating in the United States would not count towards that because they're not US national companies, right? So take Adidas, for example, which is a German company. Germany in the GNI for Adidas on their sales in the United States would count for the German GNI. Okay, per capita. Beautiful. So this means, if you put it in economic terms, that the income of foreign companies producing within a country would not be included in the national income of a country, but the activity of its own companies producing outside of the country would. Right? And this is important because in recent times there's this massive increase in foreign direct investment, and you got to be able to track on where this money is coming from. Okay. If a developing country has a large foreign direct investment, then the GDP figures will be significantly higher than GNI, because if it's a developing country, if it's GDP for Nicaragua and there's a McDonald's, and there are 3 Nicaraguan McDonald's, the sales of those McDonald's in Nicaragua would count towards Nicaragua if you're counting GDP per capita. But if you're counting GNI, they wouldn't, okay? And so that can be very confusing. In other words, it would look like there's more things being produced in Nicaragua than necessarily are, because McDonald's is a US firm. So this is the main reason why GNI figures tend to be used to measure the status of developing countries, because you're really extracting all of the production and the value of of multinational corporations, of firms that are operating outside of its particular borders. Okay, so that's a really important distinction to have clear in your mind. All right, number 2, GDP and GDP per capita at purchasing power parity. right? Another set of financial resources that are often used are GDP per capita figures and GDP per capita figures at purchasing power parity. What does purchasing power parity? Well, when making financial comparisons between countries, there's this big problem that comes up because goods and services simply don't cost the same amount of money in different countries, right? And that means that the purchasing power of a person's income will be different in different countries. For example, I'm an international school teacher. If you live in Nicaragua, you make a lot less money than if you live in the United States. But the ability to purchase things in Nicaragua is much greater. You need less dollars, fewer dollars to buy things in Nicaragua than you do in the United States. So your purchasing power in Nicaragua per dollar is higher. So purchasing power parity evens it out to avoid the differences in what a dollar or what any sort of currency can buy. So what happens then is that you have a way of seeing GDP per capita at purchasing power parity, how valuable that income actually is. That's really important, right? And so as a teacher in Nicaragua, I made half of what I made in the United States, but I saved more money at the end of the year. And there you go. That shows you that purchasing power parity is much different. And so if you're going to compare countries, right, based on this data, you have to take into account the cost of things in different places. And so therefore you can eliminate that problem. And the example that Jocelyn Blink gives us, that if a loaf of bread, for example, a loaf of bread will cost less in Nigeria than it will in Vienna. And in fact, the price of most things will be less in Nigeria than Vienna, right? And when we convert the Nigerian GDP per capita to US dollars, we get 1,370. However, that $1,370 actually has much more purchasing power in Nigeria than it would in Vienna, because things cost less in Nigeria. It's the exact same thing. And because of all this, the Economist magazine made up this really funny thing, I think anyway, the Big Mac Index. It's a bit out of date maybe. But basically it was like saying, okay, the purchasing power parity, we'll set it at the price of Big Macs in different countries. And they call it the Big Mac Index. And therefore you can use that, right, to see in relative terms how much things cost in different countries. All right, beautiful. Those are the financial measures. Now, health measures. What do we want to know about health measures? How can these single indicators help us understand the development in a particular country? Well, first of all, life expectancy at birth is simply a measure, and it's usually expressed on a country-by-country basis, right, of the average number of years that a person may expect to live from time to time, from the time that they are born, right? And this, of course, all of these get rolled into the indices, the composite indices that we'll talk about later. But this is kind of helpful because there are many factors that lead to a relatively high life expectancy, if you think about it, right? Such as good health care, health services in the country, clean water supplies, adequate sanitation, nationwide education, supplies of food, healthy diets, low levels of poverty, healthy lifestyles, lack of conflict and civil war. And all of these things, right, will lead to a higher life expectancy. And so the idea here is that a good single indicator of development is if you live longer, then things are better in that country. They're sort of happier in that country, based on a lot of things, right? A lot of different health factors that lead into it. People who are generally more educated tend to make better decisions about what kind of food they consume, especially because now, crappy food, junk food is available worldwide. And so all of these things lead into how long we may or may not live. The second health measure to look at is the infant mortality rate, and this is a measure of the number of deaths of babies under the age of 1 year per 1,000 live births. And so this, it's not necessarily the greatest indicator, but life expectancy at birth, this is another way of saying this, right? This figure will be affected by the level of health care that people might get, health services, the availability of clean water, sanitation, availability of food. Same stuff, right, as available for the life expectancy will indicate how likely it is that you're going to make it through your first year of life. And the last single indicator that we're going to take a look at here is education measures, right? And there are two main education measures we're going to take a look at. One is the adult literacy rate, and the other one is a net enrollment, there should be two L's there, in primary education. And so the adult literacy rate, this is a measure of the proportion of the adult population over the age of 15, which is literate, which is expressed as a percentage of the whole adult population for a country at a specific point in time. And here's the thing, What does literate mean? Okay, a person is considered to be literate if he or she can, with understanding, write and read a short statement relating to his or her everyday life. Now, this figure will obviously be greatly affected by the level of educational opportunities available in a country, which in turn is heavily influenced by the relative wealth of the country. And that's why this idea of adult literacy rate is a decent indicator of the overall development of a country. And if you look at the most highly developed nations in the world, you will find that they also have high literacy rates. And there are exceptions to that, and there's some really intriguing exceptions to that, like where you see authoritarian regimes. Those places, if they promote education, you will see high levels of literacy rate, even though you'll see low levels of economic development. And that's because, of course, people are going to get educated because they feel this pressure too. Okay, and the last education measure is net enrollment in primary education. And this is a measure of the ratio of the number of children of primary school age, right, who are enrolled in primary school relative to the total number of children who are of primary school age in the country. Yeah, and we know that this is part of the Millennium, if you saw the goal, if you saw the video on the Millennium Development Goals, this is one of the things. Certainly if you can get kids enrolled in school early, they're going to have the basic ability to read and write and maybe even more, right? Synthesize information, create a curiosity in education, create a mindset that is interested in learning about other places. And what education does more than anything else, and this might be super helpful to you, education more than anything else enables people to gain their own information. Without an education, if you are an illiterate person, you are dependent on others' opinions and experiences and your own experiences to create your entire worldview. And education enables people to create their own worldview because they can seek information out from other sources than just those people that are around them. And that creates a higher level of education in the sense of what can be used in an economic sense for productivity, right? People with education are more likely to be able to change their jobs, morph themselves into new kinds of workers. And if you have a basic level of primary education, on average, you're going to be able to do that. All right? Cool. Those are the single indicators of the development. In the next video, we're going to talk about how certain indices take many of these factors and roll them into an index and give us a cute little number that will enable us to measure different levels of development, perhaps more accurately. All right? I hope you found this video to be helpful, and we'll talk to you in a bit.